Hi everyone, we're online now. Welcome to today's episode of Peak, where we're joined by Micah Ingle, who's a good friend of mine and of Surridge. We actually went to the same grad school together, and we were housemates. There's like a little personal layer there. Micah is currently a PhD student with interests in critical and theoretical psychology. He takes up a lot of interesting issues, and he also has some experience with clinical and counseling work, especially the running of process groups. I think some of your work is around that, actually. Maybe you'll talk about that a little today. And he's also a contributing author and editor for Mad in America, which is essentially a hub where different thinkers come together to talk about sort of the dominant discourse in psychiatry and psychiatric in the psychiatric world from a critical lens, talking about the different meanings that the psychiatric world has for different people in different ways that aren't just rooted in the biomedical sort of model that's so characteristic of psychiatry. Um, Micah, maybe I'll just hand over the mic to you at this point and just ask you to introduce yourself. Say a little about your work, your project, who you are, and when you're ready, just get right into it and tell us what you think about what you think human transformative experience is.
Okay. Um, so a little bit about myself. I would say I'm from Texas. That's one thing. So I migrated to Georgia to go to grad school with Gary and Surridge here at the University of West Georgia. Um, I think it might be important to explain a little bit about my reasoning for wanting to attend West Georgia, because it's a very special program, and as Surridge and Gary can attest. So I started out studying literature, studying English rather than psychology. Um, so I actually first encountered psychology in an English class. We read Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, and I think it was a like literature between the world wars class, which is pretty interesting. Uh, so that was kind of my starting point, was literature and English rather than psychology. Um, and at a certain point, I kind of I kind of figured that like I didn't want to do literary criticism, which is what you do if you study English, is you read texts, you read books, and then you sort of criticize them from a certain school of thought. So that could be like feminism or eco stuff or Marxism or postmodernism or whatever. At a certain point, I realized I didn't want to really do that. It was too detached for me. So I wanted to do something sort of grounded. I wanted to work with people, right? This is the same reason, I don't want to give you my entire life story, but I will say at a certain point, I also was studying computer science. And I had kind of a similar shift where I was like, wait, I enjoy computers and I enjoy working with them, playing with them, but I don't really want to code. I don't want to be a programmer, right? Because I wanted to be involved with people and do things with people, right? So I've had these kind of multiple shifts. Like I've been getting closer and closer to working with people. But I think the literature piece and the literary piece is important because I think it sets you up with a different sort of expectation of what psychology is going to be if you start out kind of studying literature, which is filled with all these complex characters and these complex characterizations and complex plots and these complex backstories, and you have these sorts of explorations of the human condition type thing. I started out with that, and then I got into Freud a little bit, and I got into Carl Jung a little bit. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to study psychology because I'm interested in this stuff. I'm interested in working with people. I got to psychology, and I had two kind of experiences here, where one was the experience of being in a very cognitive behavioral undergrad program. This was in Texas at the Stephen F. Austin State University. So it was very sort of mainstream, very normal, focused on cognition and, mental activity in that sense, and then behavioral psychology. So I got there and I found it very, very reductive, especially when sort of looking back and comparing back to my background in literature. I was like, this is not what I was expecting psychology to be. I thought we were going to be sort of diving deep into the human condition and what it means to suffer and what it means to be alive and this kind of stuff. And that didn't really happen. That wasn't really a thing. It was more, attentional processes that are studied in laboratory settings, and it's like tracking eye movement in relationship to certain variables, and it's like, it has an application. There's a reason to do that kind of work, but it's not what I wanted to do. So that was one piece. The second piece was I started working at a mental health clinic. So I worked at I think it was private mental health clinic called the Burke Center. Don't know if I should actually have named them, but that's okay.
Well, we'll bleep it out.
Okay. So I started working there as a tech, right? Because I was in my undergrad. I didn't have a master's degree. I couldn't be a therapist, but I was working as a tech. And there was a sort of mirroring of the disappointment that I experienced in the cognitive behavioral academic program, where I felt like the therapists and the clinicians who worked there really didn't, I don't know if, I think care is the wrong word. I think they did care about the people that they were trying to treat there and trying to help. But I also got the sense that there was a sense of like a strong emphasis on functionality, which is like, all right, you're coming in, you're having these symptoms. We want to get these symptoms out of the picture. We want to get you back to normal. We don't want to see you again, which is not a bad thing. It's like, we don't want you to have to come in here. But I got a really strong sense that there was I don't know, maybe an administrative element to it, a highly administrative element, where it was like, okay, we need to get people through this program and get them back to the world, get them back to functioning order. And this was kind of reflected, for example, just to give an example, there was a woman who was in active psychosis who came in, and she like actively sort of hearing voices, and her speech was extremely disorganized. She was kind of talking in circles, and it seemed very disconnected. And you couldn't kind of make sense of what she was referring to. It was very just kind of out there, left field. And so one of the nurses was tending to this person, and she said, okay, I have to go to the bathroom. Micah, can you come sit in with this person for a few minutes while I go to the bathroom? So I said, okay. So I sat with this person, and first thing she did was grabbed my hands. She insisted on holding my hands, which I was a little uncertain about, but I went along with it. And I remember her telling me some really, what sounded to me like traumatic stuff, like some really difficult stuff about her upbringing and how her mother didn't love her and how her mother treated her really badly and stuff. mixed in with all this strange stuff that I couldn't quite account for. Like she kept asking me for money, and not like, hey, can I have some money? It was like, do you have like $200,000 or something? So just like disorganized speech or whatever we would call it clinically. But there was so I didn't really understand what she was saying a lot of the time. But there was also a strong sense to me that she was trying to say something. Like she was trying to communicate really hard, actually, really deeply. I got that sense. And so I, tried to listen to her as much as I could. And then, the nurse came back and the situation was over. But just to give you a kind of sense of where I'm coming from, I had this experience and I was like, nobody's paying attention to this woman. Like nobody at this place that I'm working at. Like she's weird. She's out there. She doesn't make sense. She needs antipsychotics. Right. And I'm not saying that she didn't need antipsychotics. She was not in a good place. She was clearly suffering. And I don't know if there was a whole lot that could be done with her kind of in the state that she was in. Right. So that experience really informed kind of this trajectory that I'm on now, in addition to just being dissatisfied with academic psychology, in the sense that I was like, okay, well, who does care about these people? And who is kind of paying attention to what people in psychosis, but also just kind of people in general who are suffering, who is paying attention and trying to find meaning in what they're saying and kind of in the expression of their symptom, right? So I don't know exactly how I found humanistic psychology. there's a kind of gap in the story here. But somehow I found the Division 32 of the American Psychological Association. I found their Facebook page. Division 32 is the Society for Humanistic Psychology. I found their Facebook page, and so I joined it and started talking to some people there. And I found a list of schools where they practiced humanistic psychology, and West Georgia happened to be one of them. And it was the only one on the list that was a public university, and so not insanely expensive. So that's pretty much why I chose West Georgia. Yeah, so I mean that's kind of I would say some of the general background of where I'm coming from is this interest in sort of the humanistic approach, what I would even call like a literary kind of approach to psychology, humanities approach. And then there's been a more recent shift in the past few years, and I'm sure we'll get to this. But I guess I'm curious if anybody has any questions or thoughts so far, because I mean I could keep going, but I kind of don't know.
I have some thoughts. Yes. Thank you for that introduction, Micah. It reveals a lot to us, I think, about what brought you where you are now and what led us all together, actually. I saw so much of myself in your story, the dabbling in computer science, the starting in English and literature, and then foraying into psychology, and then brain psychology and cognitive psychology, and wondering, okay, cool, but like, where's the kind of like beating heart of psychology that maybe we had encountered before and probably missed and wanted to go back to in some way. And I know Gary has a background in a similar kind of philosophy that I studied, analytic philosophy, which can also, it's very cut and dry, notoriously so. And so it's fascinating to me, without really having a question to ask you here. It's just fascinating to me, the kind of common threads here between our trajectories, and what may have led us all to maybe question what is human transformation after all.
I definitely want to try to elaborate on some of the threads that I heard there. Actually, I also deeply resonate with the story, and as I was listening to you, I was thinking to myself, of course, we're all going to say something like what we're saying right now, because we have this in common, as part of our history, in a sense. And the way it sort of got thematized in my mind was that you had this question and this curiosity, or maybe even sense of wonder about the human condition in its fullness. And your exposure to these kinds of questions and subject matters through literature and English, it sort of, it acted as a spark, right, that started this flame. And when you try to go further into or towards the light, right, psychology proper, something felt colder. It wasn't getting you closer to that source of heat, the original meaning that you were trying to better understand. And the reason for that, as I heard it, both as you right, elaborated in the context of research and academic and theoretical psychology on the one hand, but also clinical psychology and psychological praxis on the other hand, that there's this like narrowing that ends up happening between what human experience actually is and, right, how we end up seeing it or construing it, because the human condition is incomprehensibly complex. Anything that you say or do, right, with respect to the question of human existence is going to necessarily reduce it to something that it's not. But it's one thing to reduce it and to know that you're reducing it, and to, right, proceed with that assumption in your awareness. And it's another thing to do it unconsciously and to forget that that's what's happening. And when you do that, you risk confusing the moon with the finger that's pointing to it. So this discrepancy that it sounds like you felt between, right, these varieties of reductionism, right, whether in the clinical context or the theoretical academic context, and how in reducing the very question that's being asked in that way, or the phenomenon that's trying to be investigated or better understood in that way, that process belies, right, the very curiosity that jump started it to begin with, and what it's aiming to arrive at. And so I guess I'm wondering, ever since you became aware of this and started I guess unpacking this tension in your own life in the context of your work and research, is there anything you can say about what you've learned about how to more meaningfully approach these questions, and how not to reduce how not to risk reducing, at least unconsciously, and to go about it more intelligently, more wisely, and so that makes me wonder about the kind of work that it is that you're up to now, which I'm sure is a continuation of this process for you. So.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a few kind of ways that I could talk about this. One thing I would say, if we're talking about sort of advice for exploring and respecting and honoring sort of the richness of the human condition, one thing I would say is to read, and to read literature specifically. So one of my favorite psychologists, James Hillman, who I've talked about ad nauseum to these two, says that if you really want to understand the human psyche, you should read fiction rather than psychology. And, that doesn't track very well with what you were just saying, Gary, about the value of having some maps and having some sort of abstract understandings of, potential human patterns and whatnot. So I don't necessarily have a problem with that, right? So pretty early on, in some of my literary reading, when I was, in my early 20s, I was reading things by Robert Anton Wilson, who's a kind of a like 60s, 70s counterculture figure. And he wrote in such a way that he was always trying to mess with your frame of reference and your frame of reality. So he actually called his approach guerrilla ontology. Guerrilla like guerrilla warfare, not like gorilla. And so he was always trying to not just to tell people that the map is not the territory or the finger is not the moon, but he was trying to like put you in the situation of viewing a certain way and then like spin you around like you're in a chair, and say, okay, now look at it from this perspective, right? So I would say a lot of my work definitely has an intimacy with not wanting to confuse the finger with the moon or the map with the territory, but we do need maps, we do need fingers, right? So I mean, that's a tension for me for sure that I haven't quite figured out how to use maps in a way that doesn't reduce experience, doesn't reduce what James Hillman would call soul or the psyche. Maybe I could shift a little bit and talk a little bit about human transformation, which I think relates to what I'm talking about, but so I would say I've had kind of an evolution in my thinking around human transformation, where when I was younger, the reason that I got really into things like Robert Anton Wilson, as well as some Eastern philosophy, like J. Krishnamurti, his work, is because I was looking for transformation, right? Like I wasn't happy as a young adult. I had my midlife crisis, my midlife existential crisis when I was like 19, 20, where I was like, wait, what's the point? Like, what are we doing here?
I was expecting it to be earlier for you, but
well, in some ways maybe, but like really kind of formulating, what could be considered kind of this cliche thing of like, what's the point? Like, why are we here? And so I got really into, Eastern thinking, Eastern philosophy. I got really into mindfulness, Buddhism, some Taoism. I got really into this idea, which, so I had a phase where I was kind of really into like counterculture and kind of continuing on from 60s and 70s counterculture. So I got into psychedelic drugs, which is one thing that's important here. I got really into this idea of, I can't remember who talks about it. It might be John C. Lilly, who's used to do research with dolphins and dolphin communication, and then started doing lots and lots and lots of ketamine and kind of went off the rails. But I think it was him. He has this idea of meta programming, which was like using psychedelic drugs to sort of like go inside yourself, look at the machinery of your sort of mind and how the architecture and how it's set up, and then try to tinker with it. Right. So try to like go into a sort of meta state of awareness and then look down at yourself and say, okay, well, this could really shift. This could really use a shift, and so I experimented with that with, psychedelic drugs, and it works. There's something there. One of the problems that I see with it is that it's hard to control. It's kind of like, these drugs can often, sometimes I think about them as like amplifiers, but they sort of amplify whatever's there. So they can really kind of, whip you up into a frenzy sometimes. So they might grant you this sort of meta awareness on some level, but they're very powerful, and it's almost like they have their own autonomy where they don't want to be used. If that makes any sense. So it was kind of a mixed bag for me. I don't think I would be where I am if it wasn't for certain transformative experiences associated with psychedelic drugs. I think it drastically shaped where I am in my life and what I believe. But I also don't think it's the cure or the solution.
If I can comment on that segment right there, I think just so you and the viewers know, the name of our podcast, Peak, is inspired by Maslow's peak experience. And so, of course, there's a lot of potential for synergy, but I think maybe also a bit of a tension that you were just getting to at the end here, which is that obviously the drugs do not replace, just as a map does not replace the thing we're interested in, the drugs do not replace the actual character development and moral building that we need to do. And drugs could be tried to be used by some to what's called bypass, spiritual bypassing in particular. But I'm wondering how you view the connection. And you were also talking about a sort of meta awareness of the inner workings of the mind, which I thought was interesting. As a trained cognitive psychologist, I've definitely had an interest in doing that on one hand, but then as a humanistic psychologist, I'm very interested in, Maslow's notions of self-actualization and the peak experience. And Maslow really doesn't write about drugs like at all that I've seen. It might be here and there, but he's talking always about some case studies that he's done or some story perhaps that he heard to illustrate a point. And so I'm wondering, so we're interested in like this sort of meta awareness. I think that's treated as a good by a lot of the camps that you touched on, including the mindfulness practitioners and so on. But as far as attaining that awareness, there are these kind of two paths that don't always agree on the way to get there. And I'm in the same area that you are, I think, of seeing potential value in both, not wanting to get too lost in one or the other. And so I'm wondering how you view that possible tension, and maybe does there need to be a tension at all even for human transformation and the peak experience perhaps?
So do you mean the tension between peak experiences and then sort of like character building and that kind of stuff? Is that what you mean by the tension?
Yeah, or maybe to broaden it even, to say that the possible tension between an artificial way of actualizing and a more organic way of doing it. Because there are the two camps, and there's an overlap for sure. I live a few hours away from Silicon Valley, so it's kind of that's an area that seems to really like try and bring them both together. And in West Georgia, I think there's a movement to do the same, and same with the counterculture, although that might have been more in the drugs area. But yeah, I'm just curious how you would place that in the kind of contemporary moment, or in your own life or your clients' lives.
Well, we're gonna have to get around to Marxism and stuff at some point. Sure. But just thinking of the contemporary moment. But before I go off on my critical psych spiel, lots of people have different answers to this, and this is definitely one that you'll hear a lot, that one of the values of something like a psychedelic experience, and I think even a peak experience, I don't make a strong distinction between peak experiences and what can happen on psychedelics. If you go out into nature and you have a blissful kind of ecstatic experience where you feel kind of at one with everything. Maybe it's not quite as intense as something like LSD or psilocybin, but I think that people do have peak experiences apart from psychedelic drugs. And I think that for me personally, I should say, because I don't know how everyone relates to peak experiences. For me personally, the value of a peak experience is in pointing, right? So it's not it's not instant. It's not instant transformation at all. And if you kind of hope that it is or treat it that way, then I think you can get into that phenomenon of people chasing the dragon, right? So it's like, oh, I had this experience, and then for 2 days afterward, I was on cloud 9 and everything was perfect, and I saw the world in all its beauty, and and then so I need to do that drug again to have that experience again or whatever, right? So I think there's a real danger there. I've talked to Tobin Hart, professor at West Georgia, about this some. So I definitely think that my interest nowadays is definitely focused more on the micro scale of things than like the peak sort of experience dimension. But I do think at the same time that where I am now was pointed at by some of my psychedelic experiences, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing on the micro level if it hadn't been for some of these macro type experiences. So as a pointer, I mean, as a kind of like, it opens a door. It doesn't, this is a common saying kind of in the psychedelic community, like it can open a door, it's not going to push you through the door, but it can show you that there's a door there. You could go in this direction if you wanted to, which is hard work, and that's like the work of everyday life. So has value, but is not the solution, is not the cure itself, right? Is what I would say. I do also want to mention that, so, I had this kind of fascination with like meta programming and mindfulness, and I started going to therapy around, age 19, 20, 21, something like that. And I think all of that has helped me a lot. I think if you met people who knew me when I was 17 and then they met me now, they would be like, who the hell are you? But I also don't want to focus, which I think psychology does too much. I don't want to focus too much on sort of the workings of the mind, even the sort of path of self-actualization, which I was watching the interview you guys did with Greg Henriquez, and I think he and I agree a lot on this. There's something in the structure of the way we live in a communal, in an economic, in an architectural, just in a general ecological sense that makes some things really difficult for us. It creates certain possibilities for being and for transformation, and it constrains certain possibilities for being and for transformation. So I do want to say that I've had this shift from kind of a focus on transforming myself, which has had some success, to kind of looking at broader social systems, and that could be interpersonal systems, that could be economic systems, etc. But I believe pretty strongly these days in not that people are determined by their situations, but they're definitely and this is kind of from the philosopher Martin Heidegger, they're certain things are opened and certain things are closed in terms of their possibilities. So I would say that's where my main interest is these days. And just one final point on that is, I think that the psychedelics actually helped me get to this point, because one of the things that the psychedelics really helped me with was seeing the world. So I'd been really kind of introverted and kind of inward focused as a teenager, for reasons we don't have to go into, but it helped me kind of reconnect, and it does this for a lot of people, helped me reconnect with nature, helped me kind of, it's sort of like I took some blinders off, where I was like, oh, like there's a whole scene out here, there's a whole situation going on that I am 100% embedded in and 100% a part of. And it was a kind of beautiful vision that I experienced. And it's taken a long time, but I think nowadays I'm really moving more and more toward this like embedded, enfleshed, ecological understanding of the person.
I'm wanting to jump in and maybe elaborate on another sort of thematic thread that I'm picking up on here. So I'm taking I'm taking all sorts of courses right now. One of them is on this over here, Edmund Husserl, The Crisis of European Science and Transcendental Phenomenology. And I'm taking a course on eco-psychology. And, I'm taking all sorts of I've taken also in the past all sorts of other courses that seem to have a common theme around the question of non-dualism. And so what do I mean by this? So let me give an example, which I think will really illustrate this point. We typically, at least when we talk about dualism and non-dualism in psychology or philosophy, for the most part, it's talked about as this sort of like worldview or philosophical position or even ideology. But then I started to notice that in the psychological context, there's another sense in which it's also talked about that doesn't talk strictly about or denote the philosophical or ideological, but it's referring to a certain kind of state, a psychological state or a state of awareness or consciousness. And this is also what the Eastern meditative traditions really talk about. The example I have in mind is this, that not too long ago, I was out and about walking in my neighborhood and trying to, get in touch with nature and feel that sense of connection that for some people has been really foreclosed because of the pandemic, quarantine and whatnot. Whereas for others, I'm sure it's opened up and become more possible. But for me personally, I was trying to get in touch with that layer of my experience again, because I'd lost it for a while. And there I am walking, and at some point I get to this like greenish sort of area where there's like trees and like this plain field, and I pause, and then I try to listen. I try to listen to what I can hear, and I start noticing that I can hear the voices of passersby somewhere over there, and then the sounds of cars driving there. And if I listen some more, I'll hear cars driving even further beyond in the horizon, right, of what I can immediately see. And then before I know it, I start noticing sounds coming from afar, even from beyond the boundaries of my neighborhood. And suddenly I noticed something very interesting happen, where that place over there that's so far away, right, suddenly feels so much closer because I can hear sounds that are originating from there. And so there's this odd sense of a far or long distance, right, suddenly being bridged and becoming present. So what's over there becomes near me, right, over here. And I suddenly feel connected to a place that's otherwise far away and that I can't see. And so I saw that as an experience of non-dualism, where something that's other, something that's further out there, sort of becomes closer and near me, and I become more immediately connected to it. And then this got me thinking about non-dualism as a state of conscious awareness and the different ways in which it can possibly manifest. And that got me thinking about how that manifests in the psychotherapeutic context, for example, where if we adopt the classical sort of view of right, all I get access to is your behavior, and I have to infer your mental states based on the behavior that I see, right? I never have direct access to your consciousness or your mind. I only directly see your behavior, and I have to make an inference from what I see to what's also there. If we adopt that point of view, which I think a lot of people think they adopt, then we're stuck, and we're stuck both in a philosophical kind of dualism and in a psychological kind of dualism. But in psychotherapy, at least, what we see is an exemplification of a non-dualism or a non-dualistic state of awareness, at least as it pertains to the emotional dimension of human experience, where I start to notice and resonate with the different feelings and affective states that you're bringing in to the space between us through your stories, through your speech, through your language, through your bodily comportment. And having this shift from a dualistic state of awareness where that place is far away from me and I can't see it, I'm disconnected from it, and suddenly it's over here and I feel it more deeply, right? Whether that place is the neighborhood over yonder or the emotions within you, right? Your inner emotional life. I come to relate with you differently. And so I guess all that is to say that, psychological non-dualism as a kind of state is what I'm hearing you sort of starting to articulate and talk about. At least that's the way I saw it. And I am curious, A, what your thoughts are on any of what I just said, and B, if you see a direct link to some of the other things you were wanting to talk about, like the economic, the social, the political, and, of course, Marxism. So.
Yeah. Yes. A lot of the time that you were talking, I was just ignoring what you were saying and then thinking of what I wanted to say, of course. No, I was.
I mean, if you want, I can repeat it. No, I'm kidding.
No, I was just thinking of the really, what I see as the really elegant formula that Deleuze and Guattari, these French continental post-structural philosophers, came up with. I don't know if you can hear the siren. They came up with this formula where they say monism, which is like everything is one, there's no boundaries between anything. Monism equals pluralism, which is like everything is sort of infinitely differentiated. So like, there's an infinity of everything type of thing, right? So it's sort of the opposite of monism. Monism is everything is one. Pluralism, in their sense that they're talking about, is everything is sort of its own thing, right? And they say that these two views are equal; they are the same. And that kind of formula has been really important for me. Maybe because I think it promotes a kind of balanced thinking, and maybe this is what the Buddhists say or whatever when they say, samsara equals nirvana. Because there's maybe a temptation in Buddhism to privilege nirvana because you want to be out of suffering. You don't want to deal with the crap, But I think it helped. This way of thinking when it comes to non-dualism helps me because there was a time in my life for sure, and I think this was around the time when I was doing all these psychedelic drugs and reading, Siddhartha by Herman Hesse and stuff, where I got really into the monism piece. Like everything is one, we're all one. I am you and you are me. There's no difference between us. And I value that, and I think there's a lot to that in terms of promoting harmony and peace between people and empathy and stuff. But of course, there's problems with it, right? There's problems of if you can't differentiate yourself from other things or other people, like that's psychosis, right? At least that's one kind of element of psychosis. And especially, if you're living in a culture like we do, which kind of, I was just teaching my cultural psych class about this, independent versus interdependent self-construal. If you live in a culture like we do, where people are sort of expected to be very independent and have very strong boundaries, and you are kind of diffuse and really porous with your boundaries, you're going to have a rough time. At the end of the spectrum, you're going to have psychosis and people who get institutionalized for that. So it's a kind of balancing act for me, where I believe in non-dualism, and I also believe in like a really strong dualism in a sense. If that makes sense. But yeah, so on the I want to be careful talking about this because I usually call myself an anti-capitalist rather than a Marxist because I've barely read any Marx. I'm a psychologist. I'm not a political theorist. My knowledge of Marxism, communism, anarchism is pretty limited. But I do feel pretty comfortable saying that I think that the economic system, what Marx would call the base of the world we live in, which is increasingly globalized and what Guattari of Deleuze and Guattari called integrated world capitalism. I do think that this sort of economic system that we're living, because it's not abstract, this is what we do on a day-to-day basis, and this includes our labor as well as kind of our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors and our interpersonal relationships and all that stuff. I would argue that all of this stuff is kind of structured by the economic system that we're in. And I do think that there are major kind of obstacles to what I would imagine is the type of world that all of us could agree we want to live in, where, which is founded on kind of no one dying of hunger and people being able to sort of reach the peak of their own sort of idiosyncratic gifts, whether that's a form of creativity or love or whatever it is, right? What a lot of the humanistic psychologists would call self-actualization, right? I do think that there are major obstacles to that kind of presented by capitalism and the world we live in at the economic level. So.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think we need to deal with that in the sense that, like there's a really good Foucault guy, Nicholas Rose, who writes about, for instance, how self-actualization and sort of that whole value system has been taken up wholeheartedly into the economic sphere. So businesses love it when they and you can sort of connect up your labor to self-actualization, right? So if you work for a tech company and it's sort of, they connect up this sense of like, if you're able to program for us and be really creative and we're going to give you your own schedule and you can work from home, you can do whatever you want. We want you to express yourself. That that's perfect from an economic perspective from the business's perspective, because you're not angsty, you're not looking for change, you're not arguing with them about anything. You're doing exactly the work that they want you to be doing. So I've kind of argued that the humanistic perspective and the self-actualizing perspective needs to really be aware of what's going on politically and economically kind of around it, that we have to update this model a little bit.
So I think we might need to bring up the sort of schism between the humanistic psychology, which I don't think a lot of people in the corporate world are very interested in Maslow. And I always have to bite my tongue and talk about how self-actualization or the hierarchy of needs is, he never intended it to be an absolute. It's something that even he found exceptions in himself, like any good theorist, I would say. But one way that arguably self-actualization is very commodified these days is in positive psychology, which I'm a big fan of on one hand, but on the other hand, what you're talking about, like this, like if you're a programmer at a tech company, now everyone's working from home and everyone's probably loving it. And the private sphere is like more in the fore than ever, at least like as far as I'm concerned in my own life. But on one hand, I don't think there's anything wrong with encouraging people to reach their best, but on the other hand, as somebody who's read Dostoevsky and who kind of is aware of the potential nightmare that could be hyper individualism, with everybody pursuing their own interests to the maximum, then society crumbles. So that's obviously what we want to avoid. And I'm wondering how we might perhaps engineer, or perhaps maybe find a softer path, a middle path for encouraging people to actualize, but not just making it about self-actualization or my own peak experience, and yours could kind of go do what it wants, and we'll catch up on it, but we won't really, be like in the experience together. I think that part is sort of been neglected, and I hope to see more. I hope to see a bit more of a communitarianism in that. Again, I haven't read Marx either, like as I'm not a Marxist theorist, but in ethics, we know that we need the communitarian perspective, and we probably need it more. That we need the feminist perspective there too. And so I'm wondering if the critical psychologist in you and the humanistic psychologist in you may see some sort of some way out of the kind of hyper self, hyper individual, hyper my experience sort of paradigm there.
I mean, I think that is the $1 million question, Surge. How do we do it? I mean, I'm trying to disown this kind of language. I'm really influenced by Deleuze and Guattari, which I've mentioned. I'm trying to disown kind of I don't want to be a Deleuzian. That's not really my thing. But there is a kind of emphasis which they get from the Enlightenment philosopher Spinoza that has been really helpful to me. And it's this sense that our capacities are opened up or closed down based on the sort of combinations that we form with each other, the social body. Right? So a family is a social body, a neighborhood is a social body, right? And the way that these bodies kind of interact with each other and combine, or what Deleuze and Guattari would say decompose, sort of opens up our capacities. As far as, I mean, how to bring communitarianism, I mean, that's tough. And there's a part of me that agrees with the communists or the Marxists who say you can't do it at the cultural level. You can't do it at the individual level. You can't do it at the interpersonal level. Like, it has to be an economic shift. So a shift in the means of production, who owns the means of production, right? And a shift in, I don't know if it can be done at the cultural level, is just what I would say, which sucks, because I'm a psychologist and I want to help people emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, existentially. That's what I like to do. I don't, I'm not I certainly don't want a violent revolution or something like that. And I'm not necessarily a revolutionary either. So right now, and this kind of gets into what I'm doing, what my work is actually about right now. A lot of my work right now is trying to bridge these two things, where it's like, okay, let's assume for the moment that psychology does have something to offer, because I think it does. Let's also assume that psychology is not enough, which I think is true. If we're talking about sort of global human transformation, my kind of work right now is trying to figure out, okay, if I'm good at something, maybe I'm good as a psychologist, maybe I'm good at listening to people, maybe I'm good at empathizing with people, maybe I'm good at seeing kind of dynamics that are going on between people or inside someone or whatever. If I'm good at this, how can I sort of bring this to what I see as the necessary kind of political movements going on? Whether that's environmentalist movements or social democratic type stuff, or more radical stuff, anarchism, communism inspired stuff. What can I do to kind of contribute to these things and maybe try to shape them in ways that don't end up like the Soviet Union, right? And that kind of stuff. So, you know, I mean, I could go into some of my theories of how that's done. I think that there are people who have tried to do this. I think Guattari in the 70s and 80s at Laborde in France, this clinic, I think he was trying to do this. He was really concerned with this issue of how to be communitarian without being authoritarian. And it's a very process-oriented thing where it's like, it's not about what you tell people or what people think. It's about how you're living and how you're organizing yourselves day to day. So I'm really inspired by that kind of work. But other than that, I mean, this is, I don't have an answer to your question. I think it's a great question. I think it's the question. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, that's okay. It's a lot because it's thorny, and you see, and we see ourselves in it, and then it's about changing us, changing the system. Hopefully those two happen in connection with each other. I don't know about the same time, but if we're part of the system, I'd say, yeah, same time, at that level at least. So
yeah, I'm definitely not a what you might consider like a vulgar Marxist, where like there's nothing that can be done with the psyche or culture. I do think that, you know, I do kind of take a systems theory type approach where it's like the psyche has recursive effects and culture has recursive effects. So I do hope that they can be done in connection for sure.
Yeah, I think I'm there with you guys. Like, I don't know if what I'm sensing right now is just this feeling of, okay, like what now? Because that's what that question really makes me feel too. And I don't know what now, at least from a political perspective or an economic perspective, because I'm neither a political theorist nor an economist, economical
economist.
Economist, there we go. Thank you. Occasionally happens. And the joke I make is that English is my third language. So I guess that like, so, okay. So that being said, I do think that we can actually speak to this from a psychological perspective, not as a way of working towards an answer, but as a way of articulating the problem space a little more. Because I think one of the things we learn from Freud, for example, and the other analysts is that at some point in your early development, you go through this thing called castration. And what that means isn't that somebody actually comes and like literally, you know, castrates you, but that at some point you're confronted with the fact that, right, when you want something, you can't necessarily get it. And there's reasons for that are beyond yourself and your family and perhaps the social circle around you. And those reasons kind of source all the way back to like the social, cultural structure from which you spring and into which you develop, in a sense. And maybe another way of saying that is that you got to learn how to regulate yourself. When you need to poop, for example, you can't just poop wherever you want. You gotta hold it in until the time is right. When you want to eat, you can't just eat whenever and whatever you want. You gotta hold it back until the time is right. This is Freud's second stage of development, the anal stage, right? Because during that time period, the idea was that that's when we learn how to self-regulate, right? In line with social cultural norms that really are asserted and imposed on us by our family and within the family system, but it's a structure that transcends our family in an important way. So here's the problem, that if you get castrated and you get in a sense initiated into culture, roughly speaking, then the one of the problems you can face is that you're walking around saying, carrying that no, I can't or I shouldn't around with you all the time. And that's when we get something like neurotic anxiety. People who are, I mean, this is the stereotypical example. We don't even need to get clinical about this, but people who are like hyper tidy about everything or like hyper punctual, and any deviation from this ideal is like it's a violation, it's a crime of something deeply important, that's held in the absolute sense. But at the very least, once you get initiated through this castration, right, you become a member of culture, you become a member of society, you become a participant. And there's a sense in which you're now participating at a very deep and subtle level that you're not even aware of. But that's what allows you to do many of the things that a normal sort of person is able to do in their lifetime. It gives you a sense of overarching stability across your lifespan that, despite the neurotic anxieties that come about along the way, it makes you, it gives you a sense of belonging to the social cultural milieu in which you exist. Now, if you don't get initiated into culture through this kind of castration, that's when we get things like very thin ego boundaries. And at the severe end of that, if you want to think of it in terms of severity, though maybe that's not necessary, but at the extreme end of that's when you get something like psychosis. Um, so, and you know, maybe one or two comments on this just to like elaborate on what I mean by psychosis, because that's like one of the most ill-defined concepts in psychology, in my opinion. One of the
Ironically.
Sorry.
Ironically.
One of the most ill-defined yet most frequently used and maybe misused, right? And important.
And slippery.
Yes.
Phenomenologically.
Yeah, and one of the things that like the phenomenological psychopathology literature sort of has said about this is that there is a basic disruption of a sense of common sense in psychotic experience, and what that really does is that it literally displaces you outside of the cultural world, and you're there, right, with a sense of unbelonging, in a sense, a sense that you can't be a full participant, a member of the cultural space. And that is how it manifests too, right? Wow, I can't speak today for some reason. Maybe I'm having a psychotic break. The symptomology of it as well reflects that, right? Disorganized speech, what does that mean? You can't really relate to it from a normal standpoint. Hallucinations, what does that mean? Well, that's really unrelatable. I don't hear voices other than, you know, my own voice or your voice when you speak, right? So there's all these dimensions along which there's a rupture between self and culture or the cultural world. So the question is, from a psychological point of view, if we're wanting to change the system, if there is a problem in the system itself, insofar as however the system is structured, it impedes possibilities for transformation and transformative experience that are truly worthwhile and meaningful, then how do we do that in a way that doesn't displace us from the cultural world and risk bringing about these kinds of, like, I guess, psychotic states or experiences or positionings, while at the same time not risking being complicit in the very structures that inhibit us and cause us to carry that internalized sense of no, I can't, or I shouldn't, I'm not allowed to, I'm not good enough, or whatnot with us as we move along in life. So that's just my psychological sort of understanding of the problem.
Yeah.
There's a lot too. I'm sorry about that, but I'm wondering.
No, it's good. So I'm far from an expert on Lacan or psychoanalysis. But one thing I would say is that there is no culture. There is no one culture, right? So, you know, there are cultures where hearing voices is actually normalized, and where there's been research that's been done, for example, that people in Western cultures, when they hear voices, it tends to be more I can't do it either now, persecutory. The voices tend to kind of persecute the person, or at least they feel that way. Whereas there are cultures where voice hearing might have to do with like elders or ancestors that are kind of playful or helpful or whatever. So maybe there's something there. You're stretching me, Gary, but I mean, that's good, right? But maybe there's something there around it's not that we can get outside of culture or anything like that, but there are different forms that we can kind of organize into, which open up different possibilities. I mean, this is happening, right? So the Hearing Voices Network in the US and the UK, I think, probably other places, they're trying to destigmatize voice hearing because it's not always pathological. And the system that stigmatizes it, psychology or psychiatry, or in general culture too, it's not just those things, but this actually contributes to the pathology of it, right? Because that's why there are cultures where voice hearing is not associated with suffering, right? So I don't think we can get outside of culture and language and maybe even taboo, which is what you're talking about. But I do think that we can shift in some ways that will be really helpful. And I do also think that has to be tied. This is also Franz Fanon, by the way. He talks about this. This kind of double move where, yes, we can look at the psychological, we also have to look at the material and the economic. I think we have to do both, but I do think that it's important to recognize that there's not one culture.
And it seems to me that if we put that belief together with what Guattari called integrated world capitalism, and I think this is a crucial move one might make. It's a potential anxiety too, I think, but it might have some validity to it, is if the economic impinges on the cultural too much, or if it doesn't prioritize the expression of culture as really, I would say it's modus operandi, because I don't see any subjective reason for economics, other than obviously health, which has been objectified to death, no pun intended there, or whatever that is. But it seems to me that the highest human ecological aim of an economy should be to foster a culture of people who are healthy and actualizing and eschewing pathology, and recognizing what it is and what it isn't, which I think is what you're getting at when you're talking about stigma, and the destigmatization of certain things like hearing voices, which can be very it can be very sacred even. There's no need to be afraid of it in itself. It's one needs to place that into the context of, I think what you're saying is like American psychiatry, really, European American psychiatry, perhaps more specifically. That's all I really have to say there. There's no there's no singular point there, but
I feel like we've ventured out into territory that's going to keep leaving us feeling this way of
I don't mean to do that, but
no, I'm just making an observation more about the kind of conversation that we're having and the content of what we're talking about, which feels like I feel stretched as well, is what I'm trying to say. And I feel like it would take, I mean, a conversation like this deserves more hours than we have to devote to it. How do you guys feel about slowly, reaching the end of our conversation? Maybe a few more questions or something like that. I mean, um, and here's another thing that I've been trying to do, just to digest the whole conversation as it's been unfolding, and summarize it in my head, like the general themes that we've gone over. And we sort of started with this this sense of discontent that you had, Micah, that right initiated your entry into humanistic psychology, or at least the type of psychology that you find yourself practicing right now. That there were issues of reductionism, both in the theoretical and practical domains, which left you in wanting for something more, something that's a bit more authentic or in line with human experience as it actually is, whatever that is, really. And we also talked about ways in which we could, right, open up possibilities for questioning and looking into the phenomenon of the human condition without reducing it too much, and like what all these different options might look like. And that's brought us that took us to the personal and the transpersonal levels, in a sense, right, self-actual, and linking that back to human transformation. And as you can see, I feel like we've sort of like touched on so many different things that there's no way to linearly put this right now. But human transformation doesn't seem to be something that's just taking place at the individual level, which is, I'm sure, something we can all agree on. And there's factors existing at different levels of analysis that influence the possibility of human transformation as it's experienced from the personal level. Some of these we talked about from the point of view of psychology. And then we touched on how the political and economic and cultural levels also feed into and inform the flow of experience that we all right are recipients of, or also participants in, at the individual levels. Where does that leave us? I don't know. Is there anything you're wanting to add to that, like about the conversation as a whole?
Yeah, there is something I feel like I should add. So concretely, where my work is now, theoretically and pragmatically, is group work, right? So I'm really interested in the transformative potential of groups. Right? So this is kind of getting away a little bit from my training as an individual therapist, where I'm seeing one person and we're kind of going back and forth. I think that does have value, but my kind of primary interest these days is in what can happen when people get together and then do something together. My bias is toward process-oriented work, so it's kind of like, which means we're discussing what's happening right now between us. So oh, you said that and it made me angry, or like I'm feeling attracted to you, and you don't do anything with it except sort of all hold it together. And the space that gets created when you do this in a group is really fascinating. And to me, it feels very wide, like we're all kind of playing on this wide field where we all have a lot of room to move and a lot of room to care about each other, see each other, appreciate each other, fight with each other in productive ways. So I think a lot of my work is about trying to build this kind of common landscape where we can all kind of exist on. Whereas I see kind of the way we live now as sort of like a series of islands, where we might be kind of close together, but we're on an island. We're separate in this way. So really, what I would like to do is to work toward these common landscapes. And I think that, for me anyway, I think group work is a really fascinating way to do that.
Do you have any experiences in mind that can serve as examples of the type of process that you're talking about? Not to put you on the spot, and we could also get curious together because we've both done that sort of work. So.
I've had a lot. I'm just trying to sort of parse through and which one do I want to talk about. I don't know, just as a really kind of not a fully fleshed out example, because I don't really feel like going into it fully. But as one kind of micro example, there was a time where I was in a group and there had been some drama in my life over the past day. And I was in this group, and I remember saying something. I remember feeling very tense, like there was a lot going on in my body, and I didn't know how to kind of discharge it or what to do with it. And I remember telling the group facilitator that I felt like I couldn't feel anything. I felt like I was just kind of trapped in my body, like there was nowhere for the emotion to go, no way for it to express itself. And she looked at me and said, "You seem like you're feeling a lot to me." And something about the way that she did that, it was like almost like a destigmatization, where she enabled something to happen which was not conscious. Like I wasn't thinking like, oh, if only someone will kind of recognize the emotion that's there, then I can release it. I actually didn't feel like I was feeling anything, but I was definitely, something was happening at a bodily level, this tension. But she said that, and I just started weeping, just crying really hard. And it was so unexpected. Like I didn't see any of that. I knew that I was tense. That's about all that I knew. But the intervention that she gave, which I think was enabled by the group as a whole, and that there was so much kind of care being put into the environment, so much space being created by everyone's attention, and you know, people, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but if people start talking about their experience in a very immediate way, it turns people on, like not sexually necessarily, but they get interested, they want to pay attention, right? So the group itself, and then her sort of, you know, she was an older woman, she was very experienced. I think her kind of expert sort of understanding of what was going on just enabled a different state of being for me, which was far better than what I had been experiencing with this just kind of inability to access my own emotion. So that was really powerful, and I think that I don't know exactly how that connects to these political and economic issues, but I think it does somehow.
I thank you for sharing that experience with us. I'm especially fascinated by the point that you made about how the group and the group structure as a whole is what made that type of experience possible. And I'm wondering if you're able to elaborate on that bit of it. What was it about the group and maybe the climate of the group that you felt was allowed you to resonate in that way in the presence of others, because you did something very vulnerable, right? That's, I was thinking to myself, gosh, can I see myself weeping like that in a group of, I'm guessing 7-8 people, something like that, right? And I find it very difficult to imagine doing that easily or straightforwardly. So I'm very curious what made that special or unique for you.
All right, now you're definitely stretching me. It's hard for me to articulate.
It seems to me almost like you were accepted at a level you weren't aware of, and that perhaps was the substrate for the reaction that ensued, which could be totally unexpected. And I think that's cool. I think that kind of spontaneous reaction is what it's all about, really. That's just the Maslowian in me, but it does seem like there was a communal aspect that, if you're just sitting at home, it's like chilling in your room, it's like, it's not going to happen. I mean, unless you're just like torn up after some sort of trauma, like a breakup or a death or something, then it might happen. But otherwise, it's like you might just hold it in. And the only thing that could really activate it is that sort of maybe unconditional, almost even expectance that, oh, you're human too, right? So you should be maybe, I'm not saying they coerced you into it, but it happened. And I think that's, I don't think that's, I think that's cool transformation. I mean, it's in the moment, and we're here talking about it now as it's a significant thing that happened, for you to bring it up this way. But to me, that's transformative right there.
Yeah. And I do think you're right. I think permission, which is kind of what you're saying at the beginning there, I think permission has something to do with it. Probably personally for me, related to masculine norms around emotional expression, etc. So being granted permission, not just by her, but by the group. So I think there's a spatial dimension there too, like literally like space. We talk about psychic space, right? I think that under a kind of individualistic culture, psychic space is reduced, right? Where the like literally in some ways, who you are, what you are is this thing right here, right? You are within this kind of skin boundary. And I don't think all cultures conceptualize and embody and live out and act the self that way. And I think that there are some pretty big downsides to that sort of reduction of psychic space, and I think that group work is an attempt, at least in that moment, to kind of expand psychic space, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It ties in with some of the other examples we were talking about, and the whole theme of reductionism versus non-reductionism. Not just as a philosophical idea, but as a psychological experience, and how through group work, talking about stretching, right? Our sense of ourself is stretched beyond itself. And so we're given an opportunity, a chance to transcend ourselves and our self boundaries in important and meaningful and transformative ways.
The irony here for me in my experience is that transcendence of the self, that sort of transpersonal aspect, what Deleuze would call a singularity, like it singularizes at the same time, right? So I become, and this is complicated, but I become more of myself when I'm sort of in this landscape with others. I become more of myself. Rather than, it might be tempting to think you become less of yourself if you're sort of consumed in a group or whatever. But it's, in my experience, at least with this type of group work, it's not at all the case. Like the case is that the self gets stronger, but it's a fleshed out communal self rather than a sort of atomistic self. Let me say one thing. So I was at a conference where therapists do this with each other, this type of group work. And I was on break. I was outside. I was eating lunch at a park, and there was this woman who I assume was homeless. She was sleeping on one of the other benches near me. And this couple, this man and this woman, came up and they started taking pictures of her. And I was like, what is going on? So I said, hey, like, what are you guys doing? And they were like, oh, and they kind of looked at her again. They were like, we thought she was a statue rather than a real person. So at the time I was like, yeah, right. I don't know. They might have actually thought she was a statue, which is interesting. They would take a picture of that. But the point of this story is that normally I wouldn't have said anything to these people because the guy was an older guy. I was probably would have been a little intimidated by him. They were both middle aged. It's like, who am I to kind of be like, hey, what are you guys doing? But kind of in the midst of this communal work that I'd been doing, I was empowered by it, and I was like, hey, this seems wrong. I'm going to do something about this. And honestly, my normal self, kind of away from this type of work, I'm a little bit more tentative than that. I'm less likely to do something like that. So just as a little nugget of the potential consequence, I think.
That's wonderful. It also ties back to the question of, on the one hand, when we start off by needing permission to be ourselves from others and needing to get it first, which in some sense seems like what played out in the group with your experience. And once you felt that, there was a sense of empowerment. But on the other hand, how over time it's possible to carry that sense of permission within yourself and to feel and be empowered. And in doing that, it's not just your sense of self, but your sense of world that's broadened, and your power, right? Your potential, or your capacity to actualize your potential more fully, ends up being broadened and widened as well. So it does become a very self-internalized thing, but it's not just encapsulated strictly in the self. The world also changes, at least as it presents itself to you.
Yeah.
I'm gosh, okay, so let's start wrapping up, and I think it'd be appropriate to end on the question that we always ask our speakers. And this is also in line with the sort of personal kind of conversation that we've already been having. But Micah, if you were able to time travel, to go to an earlier point in your life and to speak to your younger self, what would you want to say to your younger self? What would you want your younger self to know?
Gosh, there's so much. We need a weekend. We need a workshop. It's not just you, maybe. It's not just you. This is a social problem. This is a transpersonal problem. And you carry, speaking to my younger self, you carry a piece of it, but it extends beyond you, and it can't be solved entirely within you or inside of you. I think is something I would want to tell myself.
I feel a sense of relief when I hear that, and I mean, maybe ironically, maybe not so ironically, a sense of it's okay that it's not okay, and it's just okay. But also a kind of foreshadowing, because it feels to me like part of what's anticipated in your telling your younger self that is that your younger self will come to be your current self and come to the realizations that you've come to, where self and world, self and others, they're not separate, they're intertwined in important ways.
It's very Nietzschean, huh? Eternal return.
Well, I want to thank you for that answer, and I want to thank you for this entire conversation. It's been very interesting, and I maybe we can all sort of resonate on this point that sometimes these conversations, when they get really complicated and complex, there is an element of us being stretched in ways that might that do remind us that this is a process, right? Our understanding, acquiring understanding, gaining deeper insight into things that we don't already know. It's a process that necessarily requires confronting the unknown and the unknown within ourselves, and getting acquainted and maybe friendlier with that feeling of not knowing, and the maybe anxiety that might come along with it. So I just want to say that I appreciate having shared this space with you guys today, and traversing these unknown lands together and trying to do some mapping, not to reduce, but to understand and to widen and open the space even further. So,
Thank you.
and yeah, and for our viewers, if you're wanting to learn more about Micah and some of his work, we will include a link to his author page on for Mad in America in the description below. So thanks again, Micah, for joining us today, and stay tuned for the next episode.